And welcome back. Now we're going to discuss what you might call the economic or the external environment. Okay. So the external economic environment is basically everything going on in the market. Okay. And that includes all these forces that influence market operations. Think of overall economic activity, commodity prices. What's a commodity again? Commodity are like raw materials. Okay. Think of, and you can actually trade commodities on, for example, the mercantile exchange. So while some of you may buy stocks for your retirement, I want to buy 100 shares of GE or whatever, you can also trade commodities like bushels of grain, yellow cake uranium, gold, silver. Okay, those are commodities. Commodities are usually perfectly substitutable. 1 gallon of milk is generally seen the same as a different gallon of milk. 1 gold coin is probably the same as a different gold coin. Okay. Of course, we've also got interest rates. Okay, that's a huge impact on the market, as many of you may know from current events. Currency fluctuation. Okay, you know how many dollars and cents can you get for every euro? Okay, currency fluctuations. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this course. Of course, wages, particularly minimum wage, what your competitors are doing. That's also very important, like we talked about in the stakeholder model, because your competitors can also be stakeholders. And of course, general government policies. So there are two basic sub-trends underlying economic growth, at least we think. One is rising trade, and that's also a mainstream or related to globalization. It seems that countries trade more with each other now more than ever before. Okay. If you're not sure, go to your local supermarket. Think of all the things that you can see on the shelves that come from foreign countries. Tea. That's a huge one. Tea that comes from outside the United States. Or if you want to go, those of you that live in Los Angeles, think about going to Koreatown. Think of all those wonderful things that you can buy in one of the Korean supermarkets. Okay, these are kind of examples of rising trade that, quite frankly, even 50 years ago, you wouldn't have seen that variety of goods available. Okay? And then, of course, there's a major expansion of foreign direct investment by transnational corporations. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in this course. But countries are starting to invest in other companies in foreign countries, or just going ahead and opening their own operations overseas. Okay. So one of the first economic or external environmental forces is what we call the technology. Okay. So, of course, it seems like we already covered this, doesn't it? Well, this is a little bit different than a deep historical force of technology. If I were to compare them, let's think about how a form of technology as a historical force fundamentally revolutionizes society versus how technology in the external economic environment really is more about doing something that you're already doing a little bit better. Okay, let's give a comparison. We talked about the printing press as a form of technology. Okay, it fundamentally changed the way people lived and thought. Versus when you go to the student annex at school and they have those really crappy DPI printers with the pages that you tear off. If you're to compare that printer to a brand new HP printer that can print 100 pages a minute. So do you see how this form of technology, you're still printing? Okay, you're just printing a little bit better. Okay, but it didn't change the way you think about printing, reading, literacy. It wasn't a cultural revolution. Versus here, you're talking about a fundamental change in reality, a fundamental change in the way people think. Okay? So these new technologies, of course, create threats and opportunities. Okay, some of the threats. Well, if a form of technology can do something much more efficiently or cheaper or better than a human laborer can, that's a good example of a threat. Okay, because then people are out of work. Of course, opportunities. An individual labor can produce much more output than they could before. Okay, so they're more efficient. Those are some examples. Things like technology, open source, and collaborative computing. These are all things that are technologically related, and they do have an impact on business. Typically, these forms of technology can have somewhat unforeseen consequences when they're put into widespread use, especially when you're talking about commercial gain. And any business, and particularly you as managers, have to think about the strategic impact of technology, not on your business models, but the dangers that they impose on people. Okay, that also ties back into which kinds of models that you use. Now here's a question for discussion when we come up with lecture. Is something like the iPod a deep historical force with technology, or is it more of an external environmental form of technology? Did it fundamentally change the way that we understood and thought about music, or did it just make listening to music a little bit easier, a little bit better? We'll talk about that in lecture. It'll be an opportunity for some participation points. Okay. Cultural environment. Okay, so cultural is generally this system of shared knowledge, values, norms, customs, and rituals that we have from social learning. Okay. So the environment of a transnational corporation will typically have a variety of cultures. Okay? Think about in your professional lives. Well, someone who works in one strategic business unit probably has a very different cultural orientation that works in a different strategic business unit. Think about if you're working in human resources versus if you work in IT. So even within an individual firm, you have different kind of subcultures to the larger macro level culture of the corporation. Now this gets even more complicated when you start dealing with transnational corporations, because human resources culture in one country is going to be very different than human resources culture in a different country. Now you're talking about human resources culture in one country versus a logistics culture in a different country, and you start to have kind of these kind of mismatches. Okay, this is where it gets very complicated. Okay, and this is where you start having conflicts within the market itself, and a degree of ambiguity on how to solve these problems. We'll talk more about that in the lecture itself. And of course, there is a divide between this kind of cultural Western economic development and other world grouping understandings of appropriate culture. And of course, postmodernism has also contributed to kind of shifts in culture, thinking about the way it shifted social values, political, economic values, and of course, there's kind of a shift in values that the West and the wealthier countries experience, and then also those of the poorer countries have experienced. Of course, you also have the government environment. So there are currently two long-term trends in global government environment that seem to be of major importance to business. Okay? Government activity, and we're going to talk more about this in the course, seems to be greatly expanding. Basically, the government tend to have greater roles and influence, and activity is being seen to greatly expand. Okay? So there's more government having more departments, more responsibilities, and then more activity within those departments and responsibilities. I mean, you think about early America. Pretty much all the government did was communicate common diplomacy and was in charge of the military. We didn't even have an income tax. Okay? Now you think about the government has many agencies, there's many things that the government does. Okay, so it's expanding and it's continuing to expand. You also have to deal with larger social welfare roles. And we'll talk about socialism in 2 lectures. But you'll see that the government is starting to take a greater responsibility for its citizens, and they want to continue to raise that low safety net to make sure that people, on average, have an increased quality of life. And of course, there is an expanded regulation of domestic industry, so businesses can't just do whatever they want. They actually have to adhere to certain government laws and regulations. We'll talk a lot more about that when we discuss consumerism. There also seems to be a trend that more governments are becoming open and democratic. Governments are more responsive to public demands, and particularly in the domain of corporate social responsibility. Again, these demands tend to reflect postmodern values promoting human rights, ethics, and whatnot. I don't know if that will continue. Okay? I don't think that anybody would have ever predicted democracy would have been so widespread, particularly not those monarchs of medieval Europe. So will something else that's so big and so wonderful come along that we can't even comprehend or predict? Probably. But what is it? If I knew, I'd be the richest man in the world. Okay, we also have the legal environment. And the legal environment consists of legislation, regulation, litigation, all that kind of stuff. So basically, it's the laws and the codified guidance provided typically by governments. And we have some different kind of enduring trends. First of all, we know that laws and regulations continue to get more and more complex, okay? More and more complicated, more and more difficult to interpret. We also know that corporations are beginning to have more and more responsibilities to their various stakeholders. That's an increasing trend. Globalization has further rendered the interpretation of laws more complex, and so we're also leaning on corporations a little bit more to voluntarily do what's right. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple lectures. And of course, ethical behavior and corporate social responsibility are starting to become codified in laws, which makes it even more complicated. And we know that law is always constantly changing, evolving, and moving. So the natural environment. So I said the natural environment. And economic activity, particularly with an expanding population, is kind of a geophysical force and has greatly been changing the natural environment. Economic activity over the past 100 years has put a strain on mineral resources. It has destroyed a whole lot of trees. It has resulted in the extinction of entire species of animals. It has created and released molecules that are not naturally occurring. Okay, think of pollution, all the trash we dump everywhere. An unbalanced nitrogen cycle, and of course, it's a big debate, we may have also caused climate change. Now, the theory is that the human ecological footprint has moved beyond Earth's carrying capacity in the 1980s, and now we are unsustainable. And so managers need to be responsive and adapt to change thinking towards the preservation of nature. Okay? Now again, what actually is a sustainable Earth? I don't know. Okay. However, that's at least the theory. We'll talk more about that in class.